Cold War radar screen flickers to life. A fast-moving blip cuts across the display. Alarm klaxons sound. NATO command centers erupt into coordinated chaos. September 6, 1976. A Soviet pilot named Viktor Belenko climbs into his MiG-25 Foxbat at Chugaevka Air Base in the Soviet Far East. He runs through his pre-flight checks, fires up the twin Tumansky engines, and takes off on what his commanders believe is a routine training sortie. 40 minutes later, Belenko lands at Hakodate Airport in Japan, requesting political asylum and handing the West its first close look at the aircraft that had terrified NATO planners for nearly a decade. What they discovered would validate one of the most ambitious fighter programs in aviation history. To understand why that moment mattered, we need to go back to 1967, when American intelligence analysts sat in darkened briefing rooms, staring at grainy reconnaissance photos of a new Soviet aircraft that appeared to break every rule they thought they knew about fighter design: the MiG-25 Foxbat. Western analysts saw an aircraft with massive engines, enormous wings, and performance characteristics that suggested the Soviets had leapfrogged American technology. Reports indicated it could fly at Mach 3, climb to altitudes exceeding 80,000 feet, and potentially outrun and outclimb anything in the Western arsenal. The implications were staggering. If the Soviets had developed a superfighter capable of intercepting American bombers with impunity and dominating any air-to-air engagement, the entire strategic balance of the Cold War had shifted. The United States Air Force needed an answer. Not an incremental improvement over existing fighters, but a revolutionary aircraft that could guarantee air superiority against any threat, known or unknown, that the Soviet Union might field. The requirement was brutally simple: build a fighter that can win every engagement, every time, against any opponent. In 1969, McDonnell Douglas won the contract for what would become the F-15 Eagle. The design philosophy was radical in its clarity. This wouldn't be a multi-role compromise aircraft trying to do everything adequately. This would be a pure air superiority fighter, optimized for a single mission: find enemy aircraft, engage them at maximum range, and destroy them before they could threaten American forces or allies. Every design decision, every engineering choice, every system integration flowed from that singular purpose. The result was an aircraft that didn't just meet the requirements. It exceeded them in ways that would define air combat for the next 5 decades. Stand beneath an F-15 Eagle, and the first thing you notice is the sheer physical presence. This isn't a sleek, delicate interceptor. This is a muscular, purposeful machine that looks like it was designed to dominate. The twin vertical stabilizers tower overhead. The massive wing roots blend seamlessly into the fuselage. The intakes for the twin Pratt and Whitney F-100 turbofan engines yawn wide, ready to gulp the enormous volumes of air needed to produce over 48,000 pounds of thrust with afterburners engaged. That thrust-to-weight ratio is where the Eagle's dominance begins. Most fighters of the era had thrust-to-weight ratios below 1, meaning they couldn't accelerate vertically without losing speed. The F-15 could maintain a thrust-to-weight ratio greater than 1, allowing it to accelerate straight up, essentially climbing like a rocket. In combat, this translated to energy advantages that Soviet pilots simply couldn't match. An Eagle could enter a fight, engage, disengage vertically if needed, reposition, and re-engage before the enemy could react. The engines weren't just powerful. They were reliable, maintainable, and designed to operate at extreme performance envelopes without the catastrophic failures that plagued earlier high-performance engines. Soviet engines of the same era were notoriously temperamental, requiring extensive maintenance and having limited operational lifespans. The F-100 engines could sustain combat power settings that would destroy comparable Soviet power plants. Raw power means nothing without control, and this is where the F-15's aerodynamic design became revolutionary. The wing design provided exceptional lift at all speeds and altitudes. The large horizontal stabilizers gave precise control authority. The combination meant the Eagle could maneuver aggressively at both high and low speeds, in both thin air at altitude and dense air at sea level. Soviet fighters were typically optimized for specific flight regimes. The F-15 dominated across the entire spectrum. The flight control system incorporated early digital technology that gave pilots unprecedented control precision. Sensors monitored airflow, angle of attack, and control surface positions thousands of times per second, automatically adjusting to keep the aircraft stable and responsive even at extreme angles of attack that would cause other fighters to depart controlled flight. Pilots could focus on tactics and targeting rather than fighting the aircraft itself. Then there was the radar. The AN/APG-63 radar system represented a generational leap in airborne detection and tracking technology. previous fighter radars could track one, maybe two targets at limited ranges. The APG-63 could detect targets at ranges exceeding 100 miles, track multiple targets simultaneously, and provide targeting data for beyond visual range missile engagements. A Soviet pilot might not even know an F-15 was in the area before an AIM-7 Sparrow missile was already in flight toward him. The radar's look-down, shoot-down capability was particularly revolutionary. Earlier radars struggled to detect targets flying at low altitudes because ground clutter created false returns that obscured actual aircraft. The APG-63 used pulse Doppler technology to filter out ground returns and detect moving targets even when they were flying just above the terrain. Soviet tactics of the era relied heavily on low-altitude penetration to avoid radar detection. Against the F-15, those tactics became death traps. The weapon system integrated seamlessly with the radar and fire control computers. The F-15 could carry a combination of AIM-7 Sparrow medium-range radar-guided missiles and AIM-9 Sidewinder short-range infrared-guided missiles. Later variants would incorporate the AIM-120 AMRAAM, extending engagement ranges even further. But it wasn't just about carrying missiles. It was about the integrated system that allowed pilots to detect, track, target, and engage multiple enemies in rapid succession. The cockpit design reflected lessons learned from Vietnam, where pilots reported being overwhelmed by information and struggling to maintain situational awareness during complex engagements. The F-15's cockpit placed critical instruments and displays where pilots could access them with minimal head movement. The head-up display projected essential flight and targeting information directly in the pilot's line of sight, allowing them to keep their eyes on the threat environment while accessing critical data. When the first operational F-15s entered service with the first tactical fighter wing at Langley Air Force Base in 1976, NATO planners finally had their answer to the Soviet threat. But the real validation came later that same year when Viktor Belenko handed them a MiG-25 to examine. Western analysts swarmed over the defected Foxbat. What they found was simultaneously disappointing and reassuring. Yes, the MiG-25 was fast. It could reach Mach 2.83 in level flight and briefly exceed Mach 3 at the risk of destroying its engines. Yes, it could climb to extraordinary altitudes. But it was also crude, heavy, and built with 1960s technology that was already obsolete by Western standards. The airframe was constructed primarily of steel rather than titanium or aluminum because Soviet metallurgy couldn't produce titanium in the quantities needed. This made the aircraft heavy and limited its maneuverability. The massive engines guzzled fuel at such prodigious rates that combat radius was severely limited. The radar was powerful but primitive, lacking the sophisticated signal processing and multi-target tracking of Western systems. The weapons were limited to long-range missiles designed for intercepting bombers, not engaging maneuverable fighters. Most critically, the MiG-25 couldn't maneuver. Its high-speed performance came at the cost of agility. In a turning fight, it was helpless. The Foxbat had been designed as a high-speed interceptor to destroy American bombers, not as an air superiority fighter to engage other fighters in combat. The Americans had built the F-15 to counter a superfighter that didn't actually exist. But that miscalculation turned out to be the greatest strategic advantage imaginable. The F-15 had been engineered to exceed the capabilities of a fictional superfighter. When it faced actual Soviet aircraft in combat, the performance gap was devastating. The F-15's combat debut came in 1979 when Israeli Air Force F-15s engaged Syrian MiG-21s over Lebanon. The Eagles destroyed 4 MiGs without loss. It was the first of what would become an unmatched combat record spanning multiple conflicts in decades. During the 1982 Lebanon War, Israeli F-15s systematically dismantled Syrian air defenses and fighter forces. Syrian pilots flying MiG-21s, MiG-23s, and even MiG-25s found themselves outranged, outmaneuvered, and overwhelmed. The Israelis claimed over 40 aerial victories without losing a single F-15 in air-to-air combat. Syrian pilots reported that by the time they detected the F-15s, missiles were already in flight toward them. The Gulf War in 1991 provided the definitive demonstration of the F-15's dominance. U.S. Air Force F-15CS flew combat air patrol missions over Iraq, establishing total air superiority within the first week of the war. Iraqi pilots flying Soviet-built MiG-29s, MiG-25s, MiG-23s, and MiG-21s faced an opponent that could detect them first, shoot first, and maneuver better if they somehow survived to close range. They didn't survive. Coalition F-15s destroyed 36 Iraqi aircraft in air-to-air combat. Not a single F-15 was lost to enemy aircraft. Iraqi pilots who survived encounters with Eagles described the experience as hopeless. They would detect a radar lock, attempt to evade, and then watch helplessly as missiles tracked them with precision their own countermeasures couldn't defeat. The statistics tell a story that borders on the unbelievable. Across all operators and all conflicts, the F-15 Eagle has achieved over 100 confirmed air-to-air kills without a single loss to enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat. No other fighter in history can claim such a record. Closest Soviet equivalent, the MiG-29, has a combat record marked by numerous losses and far fewer victories. But numbers alone don't capture why the F-15 dominated. The real answer lies in the integration of systems and the operational philosophy behind the aircraft. Soviet fighter doctrine of the Cold War era emphasized ground-controlled intercepts. Pilots were directed toward targets by ground-based radar controllers who provided vectors and engagement instructions. This approach worked in Soviet airspace where ground radar coverage was comprehensive, but it left pilots dependent on external direction and vulnerable to command and control disruption. The F-15 embodied a fundamentally different philosophy. Eagle pilots had autonomy. The radar and weapon systems gave them the capability to detect, identify, prioritize, and engage targets independently. Ground controllers provided strategic direction, but tactical decisions belonged to the pilot. This meant F-15s could operate effectively even when communications were degraded or command structures were disrupted. The training philosophy reinforced this advantage. American fighter pilots trained against dissimilar aircraft using Soviet tactics at facilities like Nellis Air Force Base's Red Flag exercises. They flew against instructors who knew Soviet doctrine intimately and replicated it aggressively. By the time they entered combat, they had already faced simulated Soviet fighters dozens of times and understood exactly how to exploit their weaknesses. Soviet pilots, by contrast, trained primarily against other Soviet aircraft using Soviet tactics. They rarely experienced the kind of free-form, aggressive, dissimilar air combat training that American pilots considered routine. When they encountered F-15s in actual combat, they faced tactics and capabilities they had never trained against. The psychological impact of the F-15's dominance cannot be overstated. Soviet and Soviet-equipped air forces knew they were outmatched. Pilots knew that engaging an F-15 was likely to be fatal. This knowledge affected decision-making, degraded morale, and often resulted in Soviet-equipped forces avoiding air combat entirely when Eagles were present. The Soviet Union attempted to respond. The MiG-31 Foxhound, an improved derivative of the MiG-25, incorporated better radar, improved missiles, and enhanced capabilities. The MiG-29 Fulcrum was designed as a lightweight, agile fighter to counter American aircraft in close combat. The Su-27 Flanker was developed as a heavy, long-range air superiority fighter directly comparable to the F-15. These aircraft were formidable. The Su-27 in particular represented a genuine technological achievement with impressive performance characteristics. But they entered service in the 1980s, more than a decade after the F-15. By then, American pilots had accumulated thousands of hours of F-15 flight time. Tactics had been refined through constant training and occasional combat, and the Eagle had been upgraded with improved radar, weapons, and systems that maintained its technological edge. More fundamentally, the Soviet aircraft still operated within a doctrine and training system that emphasized centralized control and limited pilot autonomy. The technological gap had narrowed, but the operational and training gaps remained. The Cold War ended without the massive air battles over Central Europe that NATO and Warsaw Pact planners had envisioned. But the F-15's existence shaped Soviet strategic calculations throughout the 1970s and 1980s. Soviet military planners knew that any conflict would begin with American air superiority fighters sweeping their aircraft from the skies. This reality influenced force structure decisions, resource allocation, and ultimately the Soviet Union's assessment of its ability to prevail in a conventional conflict with NATO. The F-15 Eagle didn't just dominate Cold War skies through combat victories. It dominated through deterrence, through the certain knowledge that engaging Eagles meant accepting catastrophic losses, through the psychological weight of facing an opponent that had never lost. Today, nearly 50 years after entering service, upgraded F-15s remain frontline fighters. The F-15X, the latest variant, incorporates modern avionics, radar, and weapons while retaining the fundamental airframe design from 1969. No other fighter design has remained relevant and dominant for so long. The Eagle's legacy extends beyond its own service record. It established the template for modern air superiority fighters, powerful engines, advanced radar, integrated weapons systems, and design philosophies that prioritize pilot autonomy and multi-role capability. Every air superiority fighter developed since, whether American, Russian, European, or Chinese, has been measured against the F-15 standard. The story of why the F-15 dominated Cold War skies is ultimately the story of what happens when engineering excellence, operational philosophy, and strategic vision align perfectly. The Americans set out to build a fighter that could guarantee air superiority against any threat. They succeeded so completely that the aircraft they created became the threat that others still struggled to counter. The Cold War ended. The Soviet Union collapsed. But the F-15 Eagle still flies, still dominates, still defines what air superiority means. That's not just a success story. That's a legacy that transcends the era that created it.